I came from the cemetery ready to tell my family that my late husband had just left me $86 million and two massive commercial buildings in New York City. But as I put my key into the front door of my own home, I heard laughter echoing from the living room. What my parents and my sister were plotting inside made my blood run completely cold, and they had absolutely no idea I was standing right there listening. My name is Naomi. I am 34 years old, and I had just buried the love of my life that very morning. Before I tell you what I heard behind that door, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe. If you have ever been completely betrayed by your own flesh and blood, you're going to want to hear exactly how I dismantled their entire lives. David died suddenly of a massive heart attack just days ago. My entire world shattered. I thought my family was at my house to support me, to help me through the darkest day of my existence. I had just returned from a private meeting with David's trust attorney, holding a heavy manila envelope containing the unbelievable truth about my husband's secret wealth. I wanted to share the relief with them, to tell them we would all be taken care of. Instead, I stood frozen in my own foyer, my black morning dress still damp from the rain, listening to the voices drifting from the living room. It was Terrence, my sister Brittany's husband. Terrence is a 34-year-old African-American commercial real estate broker who always carried himself like he was the smartest man in the room, despite the fact that his business was constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. He was laughing, actually laughing on the day of my husband's funeral. "The guy was a complete fool," Terrence said loudly, the clinking of a whiskey glass accompanying his voice. "David dropped dead and left Naomi with nothing but a massive mortgage she cannot even afford to pay on her own. But it works out perfectly for us. I have the legal papers right here. It is a full emergency power of attorney." My mother, Patricia, chimed in immediately, her voice devoid of any sympathy for her newly widowed daughter. "You need to make sure she signs it today, Terrence, right now while she is still crying over that worthless man. We cannot let the bank foreclose on this house when your real estate business desperately needs the capital." I gripped the edge of the hallway console table, my knuckles turning white. They were not here to mourn David. They were here to scavenge his remains. My 32-year-old sister Brittany, the undisputed golden child of our family, spoke next. Her tone was dripping with entitlement. "Exactly, Mom. Besides, Naomi does not need a 4-bedroom house all to herself anymore. She can rent a cheap 1-bedroom apartment downtown. Terrence needs the cash injection to save his brokerage firm, and we deserve a cut of the house sale for putting up with her dramatic grief all week. Once she signs the house over to Terrence to manage her debts, we can flip it, pay off the firm, and finally put a down payment on that summer house in the Hamptons." My father Gregory grunted in agreement. "Naomi has always been weak," he said dismissively. "Tell her the power of attorney is to protect her from David's hidden debts. She is a forensic accountant, sure, but she is so blinded by grief right now, she will not even read the fine print. Just put the pen in her hand and tell her it is for her own good." I stood in the shadows of the hallway, absorbing the sheer scale of their treachery. My own parents, my own sister. They thought I was a broken, helpless widow they could easily manipulate and throw out onto the street. They thought my husband died penniless. They thought I was too weak to fight back. But my father was wrong about one thing. Being a forensic accountant meant my brain was hardwired to detect fraud, and my grief had just violently transformed into a cold, calculated rage. I looked down at the manila envelope in my hands. $86 million in a private trust, 2 prime real estate buildings on Wall Street. I had the power to crush them financially with a single phone call, but walking in there and kicking them out would be too easy. They wanted to play a legal game of deception. I decided I would let them play, and I would let them dig their own graves. I took a deep breath, wiped my dry eyes, and forced my hands to tremble. I let out a loud, pathetic sob, pushed the living room door open, and walked into the lion's den. The heavy oak door swung open, and I let my knees buckle just a fraction of an inch, enough to make me look like I was struggling to stand. "Oh my God," I sobbed, covering my face with my hands. "It is just so quiet without him. The house feels completely empty." Instantly, the atmosphere in the room snapped into a chilling performance of grief. The laughter I had heard just moments before vanished, replaced by a suffocating blanket of fake sympathy. My mother, Patricia, was the first to react. She practically threw her wine glass onto the coaster and rushed toward me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a stiff, unnatural hug. "Oh, my poor sweet girl," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We were just talking about how much we miss him. We are so heartbroken for you, Naomi." I buried my face in her shoulder so she would not see my jaw clenching. I could smell the expensive Chardonnay on her breath, the same wine she had been sipping while discussing how to throw me out on the street. My sister, Brittany, walked over and patted my back with a perfectly manicured hand. "We are here for you," she said, her tone sounding more like she was reading from a script. "You do not have to go through this alone. We are family. We take care of our own." I nodded, playing the part of the fragile, shattered widow to perfection. I let them guide me to the expensive leather sofa in the center of the room. As soon as I sat down, Terrence stepped forward. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, a suit I knew he bought on credit, and put on his best serious business face. "Naomi, listen to me," Terrence began, his voice low and soothing. "I know this is the worst possible time to bring up finances, but as the man of the family now, I have to step up and protect you." I looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "What do you mean, Terrence?" He sighed heavily, running a hand over his head. "I did some digging into David's accounts. I wanted to help you organize things so you would not have to worry. But Naomi, things are bad. David was hiding things from you. He left you drowning in debt. The creditors are already lining up and they are going to come after this house." I let out a sharp gasp, covering my mouth. "What? No, David would never do that." My father Gregory leaned in from his armchair. "You have to face reality, Naomi." The boy was in over his head. "We always knew he was not as successful as he pretended to be. Now you are the one left holding the bag." Terrence reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "But you do not need to panic," he said smoothly. "I have a solution. Because of my connections in commercial real estate, I can shield your assets. I had my lawyers draft up an emergency power of attorney. It gives me the temporary legal authority to negotiate with the banks on your behalf, manage your properties, and keep the creditors from seizing your home." He slid the document across the glass coffee table right next to my mother's half-empty wine glass. He handed me a silver pen. "Just sign this, Naomi. Let me take the burden off your shoulders so you can just focus on grieving." I stared at the paper. It was a complete transfer of financial power. If a real widow signed this, she would be handing over her entire life to a predator. My heart pounded not from grief, but from the sheer adrenaline of the trap I was about to set. In my line of work as a forensic accountant, dealing with corporate fraud is a daily routine. Years ago, David and I had a long conversation about identity theft and financial security. We went to our trust attorney and officially registered a specific altered version of our signatures. It was a honeypot signature, a deliberate forgery that we legally documented as a distress signal. If either of our names was ever signed using that specific slant and missing a key loop, it immediately flagged our accounts for federal review and invalidated the document entirely. I picked up the silver pen. My hand shook violently, a final touch of theatrical flair. I looked at Terrence, then at my mother, then at Brittany. They were all staring at the tip of the pen like starving wolves watching a piece of meat. "Thank you," I whispered, letting a single tear roll down my cheek. "Thank you all for protecting me." I pressed the pen to the paper. I deliberately changed the angle of my wrist. I flattened the end, skipped the loop on the M, and finished with a sharp, jagged line that looked nothing like my real signature. I signed every single page they put in front of me, planting the seeds of their destruction with every stroke of the pen. Terrence snatched the papers up the second I finished. A greedy, triumphant smile flashed across his face before he managed to hide it behind a look of solemn duty. "Do not worry about a thing, Naomi," he said, sliding the weaponized document into his briefcase. "I will handle everything from here." The second the brass clasp on Terrence's briefcase clicked shut, the entire energy in the room shifted. The soft, sorrowful expressions vanished from my parents' faces like a curtain dropping after a play. The heavy, suffocating blanket of fake sympathy evaporated, leaving only the cold, sharp reality of their greed. Terrence stood up, adjusting his tie, no longer looking at me with pity, but with the smug satisfaction of a man who just successfully conned a grieving widow out of her age. Brittany did not even wait for me to stand up. She immediately turned on her heel and marched straight down the hallway toward my master bedroom. I stayed seated on the sofa, listening to the heavy footsteps of my sister invading my private sanctuary. Drawers were opened and slammed shut. Hangers scraped loudly across the wooden rods in my closet. "What is she doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, maintaining my facade of a broken woman. My mother. Patricia picked up her wine glass and took a large gulp, completely dropping the loving mother act. She is being practical, Naomi, Patricia snapped, her tone suddenly harsh and annoyed. Someone has to be. Funerals are expensive, and since your husband clearly did not leave a dime to pay for his own burial, Brittany is gathering some of your luxury items to sell. We have to cover these immediate costs somehow. I watched in stunned silence as Brittany reemerged from the hallway, my jaw practically locked in place. She was carrying my authentic black Chanel flap bag in one hand and my Birkin in the other. Tucked under her arm was the velvet jewelry box David had bought me for our 5th anniversary. She dropped the bags onto the dining table with a careless thud and started tossing my diamond tennis bracelets and pearl necklaces into a canvas tote bag. I cannot believe you spent money on this designer garbage while David was secretly drowning in debt, Brittany sneered, not even bothering to look at me as she shoved a pair of my diamond earrings into her pocket. It is completely irresponsible. I am taking these to a consignment shop in the city tomorrow. Do not worry. Whatever is left over after we pay off the funeral home, we will put toward the mortgage arrears. I did not say a single word. I did not scream at her to drop my things. I did not tackle her to the floor, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to physically throw them all out of my house. I just let them steal. I let them take the physical items because they were nothing compared to the financial execution I was preparing for them. My father Gregory walked over and stood over me, casting a dark shadow across the couch. "Let this be a lesson to you, Naomi," he said, pointing a thick finger at my face. "We warned you about David. We told you he was a dreamer with no real business sense. You should have listened to us. You should have married a smart-driven businessman like Terrence. Look at him. He's running a massive commercial real estate firm in New York City, and you are sitting here about to lose the roof over your head." Terrence puffed out his chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "It is fine, Greg," Terrence said, using my father's first name with a disgusting level of familiarity. "She made her bed, but we are family. I will bail her out. I always clean up the messes." I lowered my head, hiding my face behind my hands as if I were crying uncontrollably. Under the cover of my arms, I slipped my phone out of my pocket. I unlocked the screen and opened my encrypted messaging app, going straight to the secure chat with my Manhattan trust attorney. The message I typed was short, precise, and lethal. I told my lawyer that the trap was set. The forged power of attorney had been signed and handed over to Terrence. I authorized my legal team to immediately finalize my absolute control over the $86 million trust fund. Furthermore, I instructed them to officially register my name as the sole legal owner of the 2 Wall Street commercial buildings David had left me. My fingers flew across the keyboard completely steady. Then I added one final instruction for the attorney. I needed the full tenant manifesto for the commercial building located at 14 Wall Street. I needed to verify the lease agreement for a specific commercial real estate brokerage firm operating on the 4th floor. I hit send. A tiny check mark appeared confirming the message was delivered. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and finally looked up, letting a few forced tears stream down my cheeks. Brittany was zipping up the canvas tote bag filled with my most expensive possessions. Terrence was patting his briefcase. My parents were looking at me with absolute disdain. They were vultures happily picking at the bones of my dead husband, entirely unaware that the carcass they were feeding on was highly toxic. They thought they had just taken everything from me. They did not realize I had just locked them inside a cage of their own making. 30 minutes later, the heavy oak front door finally clicked shut behind them. I stood quietly at the living room window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction of an inch. I watched Terrence load my canvas tote bag filled with my diamond jewelry and designer handbags into the trunk of his least luxury sedan. Brittany was already sitting in the passenger seat, reapplying her bright pink lip gloss in the vanity mirror, as if she had not just robbed her. Grieving sister blind. My mother and father climbed into their own midsize SUV, not once looking back at the house to see if I was okay. They drove away, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my empty home. The moment their tail lights disappeared around the corner of the street, my posture straightened. The trembling, helpless widow act vanished completely from my face. I walked over to the digital security panel on the wall, armed the perimeter alarm system, and locked every deadbolt on the front door. Then I bypassed the encrypted messaging app and called my Manhattan Trust attorney directly. His name was Mr. Harrison, a seasoned corporate lawyer who exclusively handled high-net-worth estates. He answered on the second ring, expecting my call. "Naomi," Harrison said, his tone professional but laced with a deep understanding of the gravity of our situation. "I received your secure message. Are you entirely sure you want to proceed with the immediate transfer right now? Once we execute these documents, your name will be publicly registered as the sole proprietor of the David Trust, and your personal net worth will officially update to $86 million. "Execute it immediately," I said, walking into my kitchen and pouring myself a tall glass of ice water. "My husband meticulously set this trust up to protect me from the exact vultures who just walked out of my front door. I want full control of the liquid assets by tomorrow morning, and I want the deeds to the 2 Wall Street commercial buildings transferred into my holding company without delay." "Consider it done," Harrison replied smoothly. "The digital signatures you provided earlier today are already being processed by the federal courts. You are now officially one of the wealthiest private commercial landlords in the New York financial district." I took a slow sip of my water, feeling the cold, hard reality of my new power wash over me. "What about the tenant manifesto for the building located at 14 Wall Street?" I asked, setting the glass down on the marble counter. "Did you find the specific brokerage firm I asked you to look for?" "I did," Harrison said, "and I think you are going to find this extremely interesting. I pulled the master lease agreement for the entire 4th floor of that building. The tenant is a commercial real estate brokerage registered under the name Terrence Jackson." I actually smiled for the first time since David passed away. It was a cold, sharp, calculating smile. "Tell me everything about his lease, Mr. Harrison." "It is a standard commercial lease, but Terrence has been struggling badly for a long time," Harrison explained, the sound of keyboard keys clacking rapidly in the background. "He is currently 2 full months behind on his rent. The previous property management company gave him a temporary grace period because he promised them a massive influx of capital was coming by the end of this week." "A massive influx of capital." I repeated the words out loud, my blood boiling all over again. He was talking about the money he planned to steal from my house, using that forged power of attorney. He intended to strip me of my only home just to keep his failing business afloat for a few more months. Harrison continued reading the legal file. "As the new legal owner of the building, you have the right to terminate that grace period immediately. Furthermore, there is an obscure operating expense clause hidden in his specific contract. It allows the landlord to legally triple the monthly rent if the tenant defaults on payments for more than 60 days. He is currently at day 62. The universe had just handed me the perfect weapon. Terrence thought he was holding a gun to my head with that forged document, but he was actually standing on a trap door and I was holding the lever. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "I want you to draft a new rent invoice for the 4th floor of 14 Wall Street. Triple the monthly rate according to the operating expense clause. Add all the late fees, the maximum allowed penalties, and the immediate demand for the arrears." "Understood," Harrison said without hesitation. "And what deadline should we give him to pay this new astronomical amount?" 72 hours, I replied instantly. "Deliver the aggressive legal notice directly to his office glass doors by tomorrow morning. If he cannot produce the money by the end of the week, I want you to initiate a full commercial lockout, seize his office, seize his computers, and seize all his client files." "It will be my absolute pleasure," Harrison said before hanging up the phone. I placed my cell phone on the kitchen island and stared out the window. The first chess piece had been officially moved. I was no longer just watching from the shadows as a passive victim. I was actively dismantling Terrence's entire livelihood. And the best part was he still thought I was sitting on my couch crying over stolen handbags. Exactly 2D. Eyes later, the doorbell rang. I was sitting at my kitchen island calmly drinking a cup of dark roast coffee and reviewing the digital confirmation that the rent increase notice had been successfully delivered to Terrence's office in Manhattan. The timing was almost poetic. I tapped the security application on my tablet to see who was standing on my front porch. It was Terrence. He was pacing back and forth, furiously typing on his cell phone, looking far more stressed than he had during his previous visit. My sister Brittany was standing next to him, tapping her designer heel impatiently against the brick pathway. But they were not alone. Standing slightly behind them was a short, sweaty man wearing a cheap gray suit that looked like it had been bought at a discount store. He held a battered leather briefcase. I set my coffee mug down. Before walking to the door, I opened the smart home control panel on my phone and verified that the 3 hidden high-definition cameras in my living room were actively recording audio and video directly to my secure cloud server. Because of my job dealing with hostile corporate audits, we had military-grade surveillance discreetly integrated into the smoke detectors and the bookshelves. The red recording dots blinked back at me. The stage was perfectly set. I opened the front door, making sure to drop my shoulders and put on the tired face of a grieving widow. "What is going on?" I asked softly. Terrence pushed past me, stepping right into the foyer, forcing me to step back. Brittany followed closely behind him, and the sweaty man in the cheap suit scurried in last. "We need to talk right now," Terrence said, his voice tight and aggressive. I closed the door and followed them into the living room. Terrence immediately threw his manila folder onto the glass coffee table with a loud smack. The cheap lawyer cleared his throat, trying to project a sense of legal authority that he clearly did not possess. "Mrs. Naomi," the man said, pulling a crumpled business card from his pocket and dropping it on the table. "My name is Leonard Clark. I am the senior legal counsel representing your brother-in-law and his commercial real estate firm. We are here regarding an outstanding debt your late husband left behind." I looked from the greasy lawyer to Terrence, widening my eyes in feigned panic. "What debt? You said you were going to handle the creditors." Terrence unbuttoned his suit jacket and sneered. "I am handling the external creditors, but this is an internal matter." He reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, slamming his hand down on it. "This is a promissory note. 2 years ago, David came begging to me for a massive loan to keep his worthless startup ideas afloat. He borrowed $2 million directly from my company operating funds." I stared at the paper. Even from a distance, my forensic accountant instincts were screaming. I slowly sat down on the sofa and leaned forward to inspect the document. It was entirely laughable. The formatting was completely wrong for a commercial promissory note. Amortization schedule made absolutely no mathematical sense, and the interest rate they had typed in violated state usury laws. But the most hilarious part was David's supposed signature at the bottom. It was a crude, shaky tracing that looked like it had been copied directly off a birthday card. $2 million, I whispered, keeping my hands trembling as I touched the edge of the paper. "I do not understand. David never mentioned this to me." Brittany crossed her arms and rolled her eyes. "Of course he did not tell you. He was a liar and a massive failure. He took my husband's hard-earned money and blew it. Now Terrence's firm is taking a massive financial hit because of your dead husband, and we expect to be made whole immediately." I looked up at Terrence, my eyes filled with fake tears. "I do not have $2 million. You know I do not have that kind of money anywhere." Terrence leaned over the coffee table, getting dangerously close to my face. The arrogance radiating from him was nauseating, but beneath it, I could see the frantic desperation of a man whose business rent had just been legally tripled overnight. "I know you do not have it in cash, Naomi, but you have this house. And thanks to that emergency power of attorney you signed, I have the absolute legal authority to liquidate this property by the end of the week to settle the debt." I gasped loudly, pressing my hands to my mouth. "You cannot sell my house. Where will I go?" Terrence smiled a cold, predatory grin. "I do not want to put you on the street. I am a reasonable man, so I will offer you a deal. I know you have personal savings accounts. Wire me every single dollar of liquid cash you currently possess by tomorrow morning. If you give me whatever savings you have to help stabilize my company, I will hold off on seizing the house for another month. Refuse, and my lawyer here will start the eviction and liquidation process on Friday." It was textbook extortion. He was using a forged legal document to threaten me out of my personal savings, completely unaware that the hidden cameras were capturing every single frame of his federal crime in crystal-clear audio and visual resolution. I stared at Terrence, letting my hands shake as I held the forged promissory note. I forced a panicked sob into my chest. $2 million, I repeated, shaking my head frantically. "Terrence, I do not understand. How is this even possible? David never had that kind of money, and how could your brokerage afford to lend out $2 million in cold cash without bankrupting your own operations?" Terrence scoffed clearly, insulted that I would question his financial capabilities. He buttoned his cheap suit jacket and puffed out his chest. "That is because you do not understand high-level commercial finance, Naomi. You balance spreadsheets for a living, but I actually move markets. When you are a major player in New York real estate, liquidity is just a matter of creative accounting." I wiped a tear away, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "But how?" I asked, my voice trembling with fake awe. "The federal banking regulations are so strict. If David took that much money from your operating fund, how did you pass your annual audits? How did you move $2 million to him without triggering a federal review?" Terrence smiled. The bait was set and his massive ego swallowed it whole. "It takes a certain level of genius," Terrence bragged, taking a slow, arrogant lap around my living room. He was performing for me, for Brittany, and unwittingly for the 3 high-definition cameras recording his every word. "You see, when David came crying to me for help, I knew I could not just write him a personal check. That would raise too many red flags, so I set up a series of shell corporations in Delaware. I took out multiple commercial lines of credit under my brokerage name, inflating the value of my current real estate portfolio to secure the loans." My heart did a happy leap. Inflating the value of assets to secure a loan. That was textbook bank fraud, a federal offense. "And the banks just gave it to you?" I asked, pretending to be completely amazed by his brilliance. "Of course they did," Terrence laughed, completely high on his own perceived intelligence. "Because I know how to manipulate the system. I doctored the appraisal reports. I showed the banks projected revenue streams that did not even exist yet. Once the cash hit my primary operating account, I immediately wired it across state lines into the dummy LLCs I created. By bouncing the funds through 3 different states, I effectively washed the origin of the money before funneling it to your dead husband. It was entirely untraceable. Wiring fraudulently obtained funds across state lines. Wire fraud. Another federal offense carrying a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison per count. And he was confessing to it loudly, clearly, and proudly in my living room. The cheap lawyer, Leonard Clark, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He nervously cleared his throat. "Terrence," he muttered, "perhaps we should not discuss the specific proprietary mechanisms of your business operations." Terrence waved his hand dismissively, shutting his own lawyer down. "Relax, Leonard. She is a grieving widow, not the FBI. Besides, she needs to understand exactly how much I risked to save her husband. I put my own neck on the line, Naomi. I manipulated federal banking documents to bail out your family, and now my creative accounting is catching up with me. The banks are asking questions, and I need that capital back in my accounts immediately to cover the paper trail." Brittany crossed her arms, looking at me with absolute disgust. "So, you see, Naomi, Terrence is actually a hero. He broke the rules to help David, and now you are acting like we are the bad guys for asking for our own money back. You should be thanking him on your knees. Instead, you are sitting there hoarding your savings while his business takes the hit." I looked down at my lap, hiding the fierce, triumphant gleam in my eyes. I had it. I had the complete verbal confession. He had just admitted to bank fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering, all to establish a fake backstory for a forged $2 million promissory note. It was a masterpiece of self-destruction. I let out a long, shaky breath and looked back up at Terrence. "Okay," I whispered, my voice thick with fake defeat. "Okay, Terrence, you win. I cannot fight you. I cannot lose this house." Terrence smirked, victory practically radiating from his pores. "I thought you might see reason." "I just need a little time," I pleaded. "I need to go to the bank tomorrow morning. I will drain my savings accounts and my emergency fund. I will get you the cash to stabilize your firm. Just please promise me you will not let Leonard seize my home." Terrence reached over and patted my shoulder condescendingly. "Why, as long as the wire transfer hits my account by noon tomorrow, you get to keep your house for another month. See, I told you I take care of family." They turned and walked toward the front door, Leonard practically running to get out of the house. I stayed seated on the sofa watching them leave. Terrence thought he had just secured the funds to save his failing real estate firm. He did not know his firm had already been legally locked out for unpaid rent, and he certainly did not know he had just handed a forensic accountant a complete recorded confession to multiple federal crimes. I did not even have time to finish my cold coffee before the heavy brass knocker on my front door started pounding aggressively. Terrence had not even been gone for an hour. I glanced at the security tablet on the kitchen island. It was my parents, Gregory and Patricia. Their faces were twisted with anger, clearly having just received a phone call from Terrence updating them on his successful extortion attempt. I walked back to the foyer and unlocked the deadbolt. Before I could even turn the handle completely, my father pushed the door open violently, forcing me to step backward against the wall. They marched into my house like an invading army, bringing a thick cloud of hostility with them. "We just spoke to Terrence," my mother, Patricia, snarled, not bothering with any fake sympathy this time. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive jewelry sharply contrasted with the ugly sneer on her face. "He said you are dragging your feet on transferring the funds. What exactly is your problem, Naomi?" I closed the front door and followed them into the living room, ensuring they were perfectly framed by the hidden cameras. "I told him I need time," I said softly, keeping my voice submissive and my shoulders slumped. "That is a massive amount of money to move, Mom. I cannot just snap my fingers and drain my accounts." Patricia scoffed, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater. "Do not play dumb with me. You have a massive retirement account from your corporate accounting job. You have emergency funds. You even have that luxury SUV sitting in the driveway. Sell the car. Drain the retirement accounts. You need to make Terrence whole immediately." I stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her demands hang in the air. "You want me to liquidate my entire retirement and sell my only mode of transportation to pay off a forged debt? It is not forged," my father, Gregory, bellowed, his face turning a dark shade of red. "It is a legitimate business loan that your absolute failure of a husband took from our brilliant son-in-law. You are a selfish burden, Naomi." "You have always been a selfish burden. Even when you were a child, you always made things difficult for this family." Patricia took a step closer to me, her eyes practically glowing with malice. "Your father is right," she hissed. "You were always so jealous of Brittany. You hated that she was beautiful. You hated that she was popular. You hated that she married a highly successful commercial real estate broker while you settled for a pathetic dreamer who left you with absolutely nothing. We always knew Brittany was the one destined for greatness. Terrence is trying to save this family, and you are sitting here hoarding your little savings accounts while his business suffers." Every word out of her mouth was an absolute gift. It was a flawless recorded documentation of her toxic favoritism and her malicious intent to strip me of my assets. I did not even need to prompt her. She was happily digging her own grave on camera. "I am not selling my car, Mom," I said calmly, dropping the crying widow act entirely. I straightened my posture, my voice suddenly cold and flat. "And I am certainly not draining my retirement accounts to fund Terrence's failing real estate brokerage." My parents froze. The sudden shift in my tone caught them completely off guard. The pathetic, trembling daughter they had been bullying for 34 years was gone. "Excuse me," Patricia spat, taking another aggressive step forward. "You do not get to speak to me that way. You owe us for putting up with you." "It is my house," I replied, staring her dead in the eye without blinking. "And I am asking you to leave my property immediately." Gregory let out a loud, mocking laugh, planting his feet firmly on my rug. "You are not kicking us out. We are not leaving until you get on the phone with your bank and authorize the wire transfer to Terrence. We are your parents, and you will do exactly as we say. You have no power here." They really thought they still held all the cards. They thought years of emotional abuse had conditioned me to just roll over and surrender. But I was not the scared little scapegoat they raised anymore. I was a wealthy, independent woman holding a royal flush, and I was entirely done entertaining their narcissistic delusions. "I gave you a polite warning," I said, reaching into my pocket. Pulling out my cell phone. I opened the smart home security application. Patricia lunged forward, trying to snatch the phone right out of my hand. "Are you calling the police?" she screamed. "You ungrateful brat." I did not call the police. The local police were entirely too small for the federal case I was building. Instead, I simply tapped the large red panic button on the screen. Instantly, the house erupted. A deafening 120 dB security siren blasted from hidden speakers in every single room. Flashing red strobe lights pulsed from the ceiling corners, turning the elegant living room into a chaotic emergency zone. The sheer volume of the alarm was physically painful, designed to disorient intruders. My parents clamped their hands over their ears, their faces twisting in pure shock and agony. Gregory shouted something at me, his face purple with rage, but his voice was completely drowned out by the piercing electronic shriek. Patricia stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping clumsily on the hardwood floor as she scrambled desperately toward the foyer. I stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, completely unfazed by the noise. I watched with cold, silent satisfaction as the two people who were supposed to love and protect me practically crawled out of my front door like terrified rats fleeing a sinking ship. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them. I tapped my phone screen, and the house instantly fell back into a dead, peaceful silence. They were gone, and they had just finalized their roles as accomplices. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen island with my laptop open, sipping a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I had securely logged into the private surveillance network for the commercial building located at 14 Wall Street. As the new legal owner, I had full administrative access to the high-definition security cameras installed in the hallways. I pulled up the live camera feed for the fourth floor, making sure I had a perfect view of the heavy glass double doors leading into Terrence's real estate brokerage. Right on schedule, at exactly 8:45, the elevator doors chimed open. Terrence strutted out into the hallway holding a cup of expensive artisan coffee. He was wearing another tailored suit he could not actually afford, walking with the arrogant swagger of a man who firmly believed he was just hours away from receiving a massive wire transfer from his naive, grieving sister-in-law. He thought he had completely won our little game. He thought he had broken me into total submission. Then he stopped dead in his tracks. Taped directly to the center of his pristine glass doors was a massive bright yellow legal eviction notice. It was impossible to miss. It was not a discreet envelope slid quietly under the door to save his pride. It was a humiliating, highly visible declaration of his financial failures taped up at eye level for every other tenant and client on the floor to see. I watched through the high-definition camera as Terrence's arrogant swagger instantly evaporated. He practically dropped his coffee cup as he lunged forward and ripped the yellow paper off the glass. Even without audio, I could see the exact moment the blood drained completely from his face. His eyes darted wildly across the bold black text. The notice was brilliantly drafted by Mr. Harrison. It formally informed Terrence that the building had undergone a sudden change in ownership. Because his firm was already 62 days delinquent on rent, the new management was legally activating the obscure operating expense penalty clause buried deep within his original commercial lease agreement. His monthly rent was instantly tripled. The temporary grace period granted by the previous owners was officially and immediately revoked. The document demanded the immediate payment of the new tripled rent, plus all the accumulated arrears, and the maximum allowable penalty late fees. It was an astronomical figure that would bankrupt a healthy business, let alone his failing one. The bottom line stated in bold, uncompromising letters that if the entire balance was not paid in full within 72 hours, a commercial lockout would be executed by armed security. The locks would be changed, his assets would be seized, and his business would be liquidated to cover the debt. On the security feed, Terrence began to hyperventilate. He frantically dug his keys out of his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them on the carpeted floor twice before finally unlocking his office door. He rushed inside, leaving the door wide open. I switched the camera feed to the interior lobby of his office. He sprinted past his confused young receptionist, shouting something that made her flinch and drop her pen. He ran into his private office, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him. I could picture exactly what he was doing in there. He was tearing through his filing cabinets, throwing papers everywhere, trying to find his original lease copy to prove the notice was illegal, but he would find exactly what Mr. Harrison had found. The penalty clause was very real and it was absolutely bulletproof. My phone buzzed on the marble counter. It was a text from Mr. Harrison. "He just called the property management hotline," Harrison wrote. "He was screaming at the clerks, threatening to sue us for harassment. We informed him the legal department stands by the written notice and we disconnected the call." I smiled, typing back a quick response. "Excellent work. Let him sweat." Terrence's entire fake empire was collapsing on top of him. He was a man who projected the flawless image of a Wall Street titan, but the stark reality was he was completely broke, drowning in massive debt, and just days away from being locked out on the street. His only lifeline was the money he was trying to extort from me using that forged promissory note. Suddenly, my cell phone rang loudly. The caller ID flashed Terrence's name. I let it ring 3 full times before I finally answered, making sure my voice sounded suitably anxious and defeated. "Hello," I answered softly. "Naomi," Terrence barked, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He was trying to sound authoritative, but the desperation was bleeding through every single syllable. "Where is the wire transfer? You said you were going to the bank this morning. I need those funds in my operating account immediately." I dragged my fingernails slowly across the countertop, savoring his terror. "I am trying, Terrence," I lied smoothly. "But my bank flagged the transfer because it is such a large amount. They put a temporary federal hold on my accounts to verify the transaction. It might take a few days to clear." "A few days?" Terrence practically screamed into the phone. "I do not have a few days. You need to go down there right now and force them to release the money. Tell them it is an absolute emergency. If I do not get that cash by tomorrow morning, we are all going to lose everything." He was losing his mind. He hung up the phone abruptly. Returning my attention to the camera feed, I watched him burst out of his office, his tie loosened, sweat shining on his forehead. The trap was tightening perfectly. Terrence did not waste a single second. He practically sprinted out of the building and hailed a cab, heading straight for the main commercial branch of a prominent national bank located just a few blocks down the street. He was carrying his expensive leather briefcase, clutching it against his chest like a life preserver in a stormy ocean. Inside that briefcase was the forged emergency power of attorney. The document he firmly believed was his golden ticket out of bankruptcy. He thought he was about to outsmart the entire banking system. He had absolutely no idea he was walking straight into a meticulously designed federal snare. What Terrence did not know, and what his massive ego would never allow him to suspect, was that I had spent the previous evening making several highly classified phone calls. Because of my specialized career in forensic accounting, I had direct trusted contacts within the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI and the Fraud Prevention Unit of the IRS. I had officially flagged my own Social Security number, the property deed to my house, and every single one of my personal and corporate financial accounts. I provided the authorities with the exact digital details of the honeypot signature I had used on the forged power of attorney. I explicitly warned them that a man named Terrence Jackson would be attempting to use that specific forged legal document to initiate a massive unauthorized line of credit. The federal authorities were not just passively waiting for him to make a move. They had rolled out the red carpet and set the cameras rolling. Terrence marched into the bank lobby, completely bypassing the regular teller lines, and demanded an immediate meeting with a senior loan officer. Through my later discussions with the fraud department, I learned exactly how the scene unfolded. Terrence sat down in one of those plush leather chairs, oozing fake confidence and Wall Street bravado. He slapped the forged power of attorney onto the mahogany desk. He smoothly explained that his grieving sister-in-law was mentally unfit to handle her complicated finances, and that he was legally authorized to take out a maximum capacity home equity line of credit against her fully paid-off house. He aggressively demanded an immediate cash advance of $500,000 to be wired directly into his commercial brokerage account to cover urgent operational expenses. The senior loan officer took the document with a professional nod. The moment he scanned the paperwork and entered my Social Security number into the secure banking system, a silent, invisible alarm instantly triggered across multiple federal databases. The honeypot signature was automatically detected. The massive fraud alert flashed bright red on the officer's computer screen. But standard federal protocol for major bank fraud investigations strictly dictates that the bank employee must never alert the suspect. They are highly trained to play along, to secure the physical evidence, and to let the criminal believe the transaction is proceeding exactly as planned. The loan officer smiled politely at Terrence, stacked the fraudulent papers neatly, and handed him a preliminary approval receipt. He smoothly informed Terrence that the line of credit was officially approved. But because it was a high-value transaction, utilizing a third-party power of attorney, the funds were subject to a mandatory 72-hour federal review hold before the wire transfer could be completely cleared. Terrence, completely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need for cash, bought the lie without a single second of hesitation. He thought a 72-hour hold was just standard banking bureaucracy for large transfers. He did not realize that the 72-hour hold was actually the exact amount of time the FBI needed to officially compile the wire fraud warrants and prepare the arrest mandates. Terrence shook the loan officer's hand, firmly snatched his approval receipt, and walked out of the bank lobby, feeling like an absolute conqueror. He immediately pulled out his cell phone to call my sister Brittany, eager to brag about his victory. My own secure cell phone chimed just a moment later. It was an automated, encrypted email from my fraud protection service confirming that an unauthorized loan application had just been processed and flagged for active federal investigation. Terrence actually thought he had won. He thought he had just saved his failing business and stolen my home in one brilliant sweeping move. He did not know he had just permanently locked the door to his own prison cell. The federal trap was now fully armed and completely ready to snap shut. By that evening, Terrence had clearly relayed the news of his perceived victory to his wife. Brittany, never one to let a moment of financial triumph go uncelebrated, immediately sprang into action. Believing that a massive $500,000 cash injection was guaranteed to hit their accounts within 3 days, she decided to throw an outrageously expensive business expansion party. I found out about it through her social media stories. She had booked the private dining room at one of the most exclusive, ridiculously overpriced French restaurants in Manhattan. The guest list included my parents, Terrence's remaining business associates, and a handful of local socialites Brittany desperately wanted to impress. It was a grotesque display of premature arrogance. They were celebrating the theft of my home using money that did not exist, approved by a federal sting operation. I knew I had to be there. I chose a sleek, tailored black evening gown, pinned my hair up elegantly, and called a private black car to take me into the city. I did not have an invitation, but I did not need one. I was the one pulling the strings of their entire reality. When I arrived at the restaurant, the maitre d' tried to stop me, asking for my reservation. I simply gave him the name of Terrence's party and walked past him, following the sound of clinking glasses and loud, obnoxious laughter. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room. The space was dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with imported floral arrangements. Terrence was standing at the head of a long marble table, holding a glass of wine, loudly boasting to a group of investors about his brilliant new real estate acquisitions. My mother, Patricia, was the first to spot me. Her face instantly dropped. She leaned over and frantically tapped Brittany on the shoulder. My sister turned around, her fake camera-ready smile vanishing the second her eyes locked onto mine. She excused herself from her wealthy friends and marched straight across the room toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. "What are you doing here, Naomi?" Brittany hissed under her breath, her eyes darting around the room to see if anyone was watching us. "You were absolutely not invited to this. This is an exclusive celebration for Terrence's firm." I smiled, keeping my voice perfectly calm and pleasant. "I am family, Brittany. I thought we were all about supporting each other through hard times. Since Terrence was so kind to handle my financial burdens, I wanted to come and congratulate him on his big success." Brittany sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here. You are completely drowning in debt. Your house is practically ours, and you think you can just crash an elite networking event. You do not belong in a room like this anymore. Look at these people. They are the top tier of Manhattan real estate. You cannot afford to be seen with the elite." She pointed a manicured finger toward a small, dimly lit two-person table situated near T.H. E. swinging kitchen doors, far away from the main celebration. "If you insist on staying and embarrassing yourself, you can sit over there," Brittany ordered loudly, ensuring a few of the nearby guests heard her. "Do not talk to Terrence's investors and do not order anything expensive. I am not paying for your charity meal." I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply smiled a genuine, terrifying smile that made her blink in confusion. "Thank you, Brittany," I said gracefully. "That table looks absolutely perfect." I walked over to the small table in the back and sat down. Brittany turned back to her guests, rolling her eyes and acting like the gracious hostess who had just dealt with a crazy relative. A young, sharply dressed waiter approached my table almost immediately, looking slightly apologetic for my seating arrangement. "Can I get you a glass of tap water, ma'am?" he asked gently. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice clear and loud enough to carry across the room, I would like to order a bottle of champagne to celebrate my brother-in-law's success. Do you have the 2008 vintage Louis Roederer crystal? The waiter blinked, clearly caught off guard. We do, ma'am, but that bottle is $4,000. Perfect, I replied. I will take it, and please keep the tab open under my name. I opened my clutch and pulled out the heavy, solid metal black card issued exclusively by the Manhattan trust firm to clients with ultra-high net worth accounts. I placed it gently on the waiter's silver tray. The card hit the metal surface with a distinct heavy clink. It was not a standard credit card. It was a solid titanium wealth management card, exclusively minted for individuals holding liquid assets north of $50 million. The sheer weight of it was undeniable. The waiter looked down at the card and his entire posture instantly transformed. He recognized the insignia immediately. It was a card that demanded absolute, unquestioning respect, the kind of card Terrence and Brittany could only dream of holding. Right away, madam, the waiter said, bowing his head with deep reverence. I will bring it out immediately. As the waiter hurried away, I looked across the room. Terrence and Brittany were staring at me, their faces suddenly tight with confusion. They had heard the price of the champagne. They had seen the waiter's dramatic shift in behavior. The first tiny seed of panic had just been planted in their minds, and the night was only just beginning. Terrence excused himself from his group of wealthy investors and practically marched over to my small table in the corner. His eyes were locked on my hands, searching for the heavy metal card I had just handed to the waiter. He slammed his palms down on my table, leaning in close so the other guests would not hear him over the ambient music. What was that? Terrence demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. What kind of card did you just give that waiter, Naomi? Do not lie to me. I saw the way he reacted to it. I calmly picked up my cloth napkin and placed it on my lap. I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Terrence. It is just a standard bank rewards card. Terrence scoffed, his face turning red with sudden suspicion. Do not play games with me. You said you were broke. You said your accounts were frozen. Did David have a secret stash of cash he hid from my firm? Are you spending the money you owe me on $4,000 champagne? He reached across the table, his hand darting out to try and snatch my clutch purse right out of my lap. I swiftly moved the purse out of his reach, maintaining my perfectly composed smile. I suggest you lower your voice, Terrence. You are making a scene in front of your very important investors. My bank issued a temporary promotional card while my accounts are on hold. That is all. Now, please go back to your party. You are interrupting my dinner. Terrence glared at me, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. If I find out you are hiding David's money from me, I will have my lawyers drain every single cent you possess. He turned on his heel and stormed back to the main table, grabbing a fresh glass of whiskey from a passing tray and downing it in one single gulp. A few minutes later, the waiter returned to my table reverently carrying the chilled bottle of vintage crystal. He poured it flawlessly into my crystal flute. I took a slow, luxurious sip, letting the crisp bubbles dance on my tongue. It tasted exactly like victory. From my vantage point in the corner, I had the perfect view of the entire room. I watched Terrence try to regain his confident swagger, but the brief interaction with me had clearly rattled him. Then it happened. Right in the middle of a pompous toast being given by my father, Terrence's cell phone buzzed loudly on the marble table. Terrence picked it up, expecting it to be a congratulatory message from a client or a business update. Instead, I watched his expression morph from mild annoyance to absolute, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face so quickly he looked like he was going to pass out right into his plate of expensive caviar. He stared at the glowing screen, his eyes wide and unblinking. I knew exactly what that email said. My contacts at the Federal Fraud Prevention Unit had informed me of their automated notification protocols. The bank had officially updated the status of his fraudulent line of credit application. The email explicitly stated that the requested $500,000 transfer was no longer just on a standard administrative hold. It had been officially escalated. The subject line read, "Urgent notice of federal review and asset verification." Terrence began to sweat profusely. He tugged violently at the collar of his expensive tailored shirt, suddenly suffocating in his own clothes. Brittany leaned over and touched his arm, asking him what was wrong. Terrence violently shoved her hand away, completely ignoring his own wife. He frantically scrolled through the email, reading the terrifying federal jargon. The bank was demanding immediate in-person authentication of the power of attorney document by the original signatory to clear the federal block. He was completely trapped. His rent was due in less than 24 hours. His prestigious office was about to be locked down, and his stolen money was now permanently locked inside an active federal investigation vault. Terrence abruptly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He ignored the confused stares of his wealthy investors and my parents. He lunged toward his leather briefcase resting near the wall, tearing it open and frantically pulling out a crumpled stack of legal papers. He practically sprinted across the dining room back to my small table, his breathing heavy and erratic. He slapped a secondary confirmation document down right next to my crystal champagne flute. He pulled a silver pen from his pocket and shoved it aggressively toward my hand. "Sign this," Terrence hissed, his voice trembling with sheer panic. "Sign this paper right now, Naomi." I looked down at the document. It was a secondary bank authorization form, essentially a sworn legal affidavit confirming that the original power of attorney was legitimate and that I fully consented to the massive line of credit. I took another slow sip of my expensive champagne, letting the silence stretch. "Why would I sign that, Terrence?" I asked innocently. "I thought you already had all the power you needed." Terrence leaned over the table, his face practically inches from mine, sweating profusely. "The bank is being ridiculous," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room. "They flagged the transfer because of the high dollar amount. They just need a secondary physical signature to release the hold. Do it now, Naomi. If you do not sign this right now, I lose my office tomorrow morning." I set my crystal flute down on the white tablecloth, looking up at his terrified, sweating face. The arrogant Wall Street titan had vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, cornered criminal begging his own victim for a lifeline. I picked up the silver pen he had shoved toward me. Terrence let out a loud, shaky exhale of relief, assuming I was finally submitting to his demands. He practically leaned over my plate, waiting for the ink to hit the paper. Instead, I held the pen up in the air and tapped it gently against the side of my crystal glass. The sharp, high-pitched clink echoed through our quiet corner of the room. "I am not signing this, Terrence," I said, but I did not whisper. I projected my voice clearly and loudly across the dining room, ensuring every single syllable carried over the soft, ambient jazz music. "I am not signing a sworn legal affidavit to authorize a $500,000 line of credit against my fully paid-off home so you can bail out your failing real estate brokerage." The effect was instantaneous. Conversations at the main table stopped dead. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the private dining room. Several wealthy investors turned their heads, staring directly at Terrence with expressions of profound confusion and sudden suspicion. Terrence turned completely white. He lunged forward, grabbing the edge of my small table with both hands. "Shut up," he hissed frantically, his eyes darting nervously toward his investors. "Are you out of your mind? Keep your voice down right now." I did not lower my voice. In fact, I stood up, pushing my chair back loudly against the hardwood floor. "Why should I keep my voice down, Terrence? You brought this document to my table in the middle of a celebration. You are the one demanding I commit financial perjury to save your office from being legally locked down tomorrow morning. Are you trying to steal my house right in front of your most important clients?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. One of the investors, an older gentleman in a custom-tailored suit, actually set his wine glass down and crossed his arms, staring at Terrence with absolute disgust. Before Terrence could even attempt to formulate a lie to save his crumbling reputation, my mother, Patricia, stormed across the room. Her face was flushed dark red with embarrassment and fury. She shoved Terrence aside and got right in my face, her expensive perfume suffocating me. "How dare you?" Patricia screamed, completely abandoning the refined high society persona she had been projecting all evening. "You are an absolute disgrace, Naomi. We invite you here out of the goodness of our hearts, and you pull this psychotic stunt just to embarrass us. You are nothing but an ungrateful, jealous daughter who cannot stand seeing her sister happy. You are actively trying to ruin Brittany's marriage because your own husband was a massive failure." My father Gregory arrived right behind her, pointing a thick, angry finger at the door. "You need to leave right now," he bellowed. "You are having a mental breakdown. We are going to have you legally committed for this." "Do you hear me?" Brittany was standing near the main table, hiding her face in her hands, playing the role of the humiliated victim perfectly. But her investors were not looking at her with sympathy. They were looking at Terrence like he was a massive financial liability. I looked at my mother, then at my father, and finally at Terrence, who was currently vibrating with a mixture of absolute panic and explosive rage. He looked like a man who had just realized the parachute he packed was actually filled with heavy rocks. I picked up my titanium black card from the silver tray the waiter had left behind and slipped it back into my designer clutch. I smoothed out the front of my black evening gown, completely ignoring my parents' screaming. "You do not have to ask me to leave," I said smoothly, my voice echoing in the dead, silent room. "I have seen exactly what I came here to see. Thank you all so much for the entertainment tonight. It was truly unforgettable. Good luck with the bank tomorrow, Terrence. I have a feeling you are going to need an absolute miracle." I turned my back on them and walked out of the private dining room. I kept my head held high, my posture perfect, and my steps measured and elegant. I did not run. I did not look back. As the heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind me, the muffled sounds of absolute chaos erupted from inside the room. I could hear one of the investors loudly demanding to know if Terrence's firm was actually facing a commercial eviction. I heard Terrence stammering, desperately trying to lie his way out of a burning building, and I heard my mother shrieking my name. I walked through the main restaurant lobby, stepped out into the crisp New York night air, and climbed into the back of my waiting private car. Terrence thought the worst thing happening to him was losing his investors and his office space. He still had absolutely no idea about the federal mandates waiting for him. The trap was locked, the key was thrown away, and my revenge was only just getting started. The morning after the disastrous dinner party, I arrived early at my corporate office in Midtown Manhattan. The adrenaline from the previous night had settled into a cold, sharp focus. I sat at my desk reviewing the latest encrypted updates from my trust attorney, Mr. Harrison. Terrence was officially locked out of his office. Building security had changed the deadbolts at exactly 6:00 that morning. But before I could even process the massive satisfaction of that particular victory, my secure office phone rang loudly. It was the front desk receptionist, and she sounded incredibly stressed. She told me my parents were in the lobby, and they were threatening to call building security if I did not come out to see them immediately. I took a deep breath, smoothed my tailored skirt, and walked out to the main reception area. Gregory and Patricia were pacing aggressively across the marble floor. They were dressed in their usual pretentious country club attire, completely out of place in a high-security forensic accounting firm. When Patricia saw me, her eyes narrowed with pure venom. She did not bother saying hello. She simply grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin, and dragged me toward the nearest empty glass conference room. My father followed closely behind, carrying a massive, thick leather binder. He slammed the conference room door shut and immediately threw the heavy binder onto the polished mahogany table. The loud thud echoed in the small space. "Sit down, Naomi," my father commanded, his voice dripping with absolute authority. "We are done playing these childish games with you." I remained standing, crossing my arms over my chest. "I am at work," I said calmly. "You have exactly 3 minutes to tell me what you want before I have security escort you out of the building." Patricia let out a harsh, condescending laugh. "You are not calling security on anyone," she sneered. Ray in absolutely no position to make demands after the psychotic stunt you pulled last night. You embarrassed this family in front of Manhattan's elite. You tried to humiliate Terrence while he is working tirelessly to save you from your own financial ruin." Gregory tapped his thick finger against the leather binder on the table. "You are clearly having a severe mental breakdown due to your grief," he stated coldly. "You are acting erratically. You are refusing to pay your husband's legitimate debts, and you are creating public disturbances. Terrence called us this morning in tears. He said his office was illegally locked down because you failed to authorize the bank transfer. You are deliberately destroying your own family." I stared at the binder, recognizing the legal formatting on the visible tabs. "What is that?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "It is your wake-up call," Patricia said, stepping closer to me. "It is an emergency petition for a conservatorship." The word hung in the air, heavy and incredibly toxic. A conservatorship. It is a severe legal mechanism in the United States designed for individuals who are entirely incapacitated, like elderly patients with advanced dementia or people in comas. It strips a person of their basic human rights, handing total control of their finances, medical decisions, and personal autonomy over to a legal guardian. We have already spoken to a family court judge and a private psychiatric evaluator, Gregory boasted, looking incredibly smug. They both agree that your current behavior is highly indicative of a severe grief-induced psychotic break. If you do not wire that $500,000 to Terrence by noon today, we are filing this petition at 100. The court will freeze every single one of your bank accounts. They will appoint us as your permanent legal guardians. Patricia smiled a chilling, triumphant expression. Once we are in control of your estate, Naomi, we will authorize the sale of your house ourselves. We will pay Terrence what he is owed, and we will put you in a quiet residential facility where you can get the psychiatric help you so clearly need. You will not have access to a single credit card, a vehicle, or a cell phone without our explicit written permission. I stood absolutely still, processing the sheer magnitude of their cruelty. They were not just trying to steal my money anymore. They were actively attempting to erase my entire existence. They were willing to lock their own daughter in a psychiatric ward and strip away her civil liberties just to fund their golden child's fake lifestyle. They thought the threat of a conservatorship would break my spirit completely. They thought I would drop to my knees and beg for mercy. Instead, my mind began calculating the exact legal requirements of a conservatorship hearing. To file that petition, they would have to submit all of their own financial records to the court to prove they were responsible fiduciaries. They would have to testify under oath. They were literally volunteering to walk into a federal courthouse and put their names on the public record right as the FBI was closing in on Terrence. "You have until noon, Naomi," my father threatened, pointing at the door. "Wire the money or lose your freedom. The choice is yours." They turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving the heavy binder on the table as a terrifying reminder of their power. I waited until they were in the elevator before I picked up the binder and walked back to my desk. I did not feel fear. I felt the absolute undeniable thrill of watching my enemies willingly walk straight into the deadliest trap I could have ever designed. I dropped the binder on the conference room table and sprinted out into the hallway, catching up to my parents just as they reached the elevator bank. "Wait," I called out, letting my voice crack with manufactured panic. "Please do not do this." Gregory and Patricia turned around. The smug satisfaction on their faces was absolutely sickening. They had been waiting for this exact reaction. They thrived on my submission. I forced my hands to shake as I approached them, playing the role of the terrified, broken daughter to absolute perfection. "You cannot file that petition," I pleaded, letting a few tears spill over my eyelashes. "Please, Mom, I am just grieving. I am stressed. I am not crazy. If you take away my legal rights, I will lose my job. I will lose everything David and I built. Just give me more time." My mother stepped forward, her posture rigid and completely devoid of maternal warmth. She looked at me like I was a diseased animal standing in her pristine hallway. "We are doing this for your own good," Patricia stated coldly, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "You have lost your mind, Naomi. You are hallucinating wealth, acting erratically in public, and deliberately trying to ruin your sister's life. You are entirely unfit to manage your own affairs." "But I am Aunt," I begged, wrapping my arms around myself as if I were trying to hold my fragile reality together. "I promise I will behave. Just please do not take my autonomy away." My father pressed the elevator button, not even bothering to look at me. "You have until noon to wire that $500,000 to Terrence," Gregory ordered flatly. "If the money is not in his operating account by the time the clock strikes 12, we march straight into the courthouse and file the paperwork. The choice is entirely yours." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. They stepped inside, standing side by side like two victorious generals who had just conquered a weak enemy. I took a step back, letting my shoulders slump in complete defeat, burying my face in my hands. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off their arrogant glares. The second the elevator mechanism locked and the numbers began to descend, my tears instantly stopped, my posture straightened. The terrified, trembling daughter vanished, replaced once again by the cold, calculating forensic accountant. I turned around and walked briskly back to my private office. I locked the door, closed the automated window blinds, and immediately picked up my secure phone to call my trust attorney, Mr. Harrison. He answered on the first ring. "Harrison, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice sharp and completely steady. My parents. We're just here. They brought a drafted petition for an emergency conservatorship. They are threatening to file it today if I do not pay off Terrence's forged debt. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Naomi, that is incredibly dangerous, Harrison warned, his professional tone suddenly laced with genuine concern. A conservatorship petition in New York State is a nuclear legal option. Even if we can easily prove you are perfectly sane and financially solvent, the mere filing of that document can temporarily freeze your public assets and trigger a mandatory court investigation. We need to file a preemptive injunction right now to block them from submitting those papers. No, I replied instantly. Do not block it. In fact, I want you to make sure the family court docket is completely clear for them. I want them to file it. Harrison was silent for a long moment. You want them to file a petition to legally declare you mentally incompetent. Why on earth would you allow that? Because they are absolute fools who do not understand the legal system they are trying to weaponize against me, I explained, a vicious smile spreading across my face. Think about it, Harrison. In order for a judge to grant a conservatorship, the petitioners must prove they are responsible fiduciaries. They have to submit to a rigorous background check. They are legally required to file their own comprehensive financial disclosures under penalty of perjury. They have to open their books to the federal court to prove they have the financial stability to manage my estate. I heard Harrison chuckle softly on the other end of the line as the brilliance of the strategy dawned on him. They will have to submit their bank statements and tax returns, he murmured, the excitement growing in his voice. Exactly, I said. My parents have been secretly funneling money to Brittany and Terrence for years to support their fake luxury lifestyle. Their finances are completely entangled with Terrence's failing brokerage. If they file this petition, they are voluntarily handing over their entire financial history to a federal judge right as the FBI is preparing to arrest Terrence for major bank fraud. They will inadvertently implicate themselves as financial enablers and potential co-conspirators. It is a legal suicide mission, Harrison noted, his keyboard already clicking rapidly as he began pulling up the necessary court schedules. It is, I agreed. They think they are dragging me into a dark alley to rob me. They do not realize they are dragging me onto a brightly lit federal stage where I hold every single piece of evidence. Let them file the petition, Harrison. Do not stand in their way. When the court date arrives, we are going to let them perjure themselves right in front of the judge, and then we are going to drop the $86 million trust document right on their heads. I will have our litigation team prepare the defense exhibits immediately, Harrison promised. We will let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly can. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my leather chair. It was barely 9:00 in the morning, and the trap was now flawlessly set. I just had to wait for noon. Noon came and went in absolute silence. I did not log into my bank. I did not authorize any wire transfers. I simply sat at my desk and watched the clock tick past 12. By 1:00, Mr. Harrison sent me a brief encrypted text message confirming that Gregory and Patricia had officially filed the emergency conservatorship petition with the New York Family Court. They had willingly submitted their preliminary financial disclosures alongside the psychiatric evaluation they bought from that corrupt doctor. The hearing was expedited and scheduled for the end of the week. But my parents were not the only ones making their moves. Almost exactly at the moment the legal paperwork was stamped, my phone began to vibrate aggressively on my desk. It started with a few direct messages from cousins I had not spoken to in years. Then came the barrage of text messages, angry voicemails, and notifications from various social media platforms. I opened my feed, and immediately saw why my sister Brittany had taken her performance public. She had posted a highly edited, emotionally manipulative video to her hundreds of thousands of followers. In the video, she was sitting on the floor of her luxurious living room, wearing absolutely no makeup to look as distressed as possible. She was clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes red and puffy from crying forced tears. "I do not usually share such personal family trauma online," Brittany whimpered to the camera, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. "But my sister Naomi is going through a severe mental health crisis following the tragic death of her husband. She has completely lost her grip on reality. Instead of accepting the financial and emotional help my husband Terrence so generously offered, she has become aggressively ranid and vindictive. She is actively trying to destroy my family out of pure jealousy and spite. She even crashed a private dinner last night to scream at us in public." Brittany dabbed her dry eyes and looked directly into the lens. "My parents are doing everything they can to get her legally committed to a facility where she can be kept safe from herself, but her delusions are tearing our family apart. Please send us prayers. It is so hard to watch someone you love turn into a monster." The video went viral within our local social circles in a matter of hours. The comment section was a horrifying echo chamber of blind support for Brittany and absolute vitriol directed at me. My extended family, who had always blindly worshipped the ground the golden child walked on, unleashed a torrent of abuse. My aunt left a voicemail calling me a psychotic, ungrateful wretch. Former high school classmates sent messages telling me I needed to be locked up in a padded room. They called me selfish. They called me crazy. They told me David would be ashamed of me. It was a meticulously coordinated smear campaign designed to break my spirit and isolate me completely before the court date. They wanted me to feel so alienated and hated that I would show up to the hearing as a sobbing, nervous wreck, perfectly matching the erratic profile they had constructed. But they fundamentally misunderstood the woman they were dealing with. I did not cry. I did not reply to a single text message or comment. I put my cell phone on silent, tossed it into the bottom drawer of my desk, and locked it. I did not care about the opinions of a community that believed the lies of a fake influencer. I only cared about the lethal, undeniable truth hidden in the numbers. I opened a fresh encrypted spreadsheet on my dual monitors. For the next 3 days, while my family dragged my name through the digital mud, I spent every waking hour quietly auditing Terrence's entire public financial history. As a licensed forensic accountant, I had access to deep public records, corporate filings, and real estate transaction databases that average citizens did not even know existed. I started pulling every single LLC registration associated with Terrence's name over the past decade. I cross-referenced his reported commercial property acquisitions with the actual county tax records. What I found was a staggering complex web of continuous fraud. Terrence had not just faked a single promissory note. His entire career was built on a massive Ponzi scheme of inflated assets and borrowed capital. He had been quietly moving money between 6 different shell corporations in Delaware, creating fake revenue streams to secure massive bank loans, and then using the new loans to pay off the interest on the old ones. He was completely insolvent. His firm had a negative net worth in the millions. My parents, I discovered through cross-referencing property records, had secretly taken out second mortgages on their own home just to bail him out of a failed commercial deal 2 years prior. That was why they were so desperate to steal my house. If Terrence went down, he was taking Gregory and Patricia into bankruptcy with him. I meticulously compiled every document, every fraudulent tax filing, and every fake property appraisal into a massive indexed digital file. I forwarded the entire dossier to Mr. Harrison and the federal agents assigned to my case. Let Brittany have her online sympathy. I was building a guillotine. The 72-hour deadline expired at exactly 6 a.m. on Thursday. I was already awake, sitting in my home office with a fresh cup of coffee, staring at the live security feed from 14 Wall Street. Mr. Harrison had coordinated everything perfectly with the building's on-site management team. As the digital clock on my monitor flipped to 6:01, I picked up my phone and called the head of security for the property. "Execute the lockout," I said simply. "Yes, ma'am," the security chief replied. Through the camera, I watched a team of 3 uniformed security guards and a master locksmith step off the elevator onto the 4th floor. They moved with quiet professional efficiency. Within 10 minutes, the electronic key card readers on Terrence's glass double doors were completely deactivated and reprogrammed. Heavy steel deadbolts were replaced. A massive glaring red notice of commercial property seizure was taped directly to the glass right over the gold lettering of Terrence's firm. The notice formally declared that due to the failure to satisfy the outstanding rent and the triggered penalty clauses, the landlord had officially taken possession of the premises. Every single item inside that office, the sleek desktop computers, the leather executive chairs, the filing cabinets filled with client contracts, and the private servers containing all of his fraudulent accounting data, now legally belonged to me. At 8:30, the elevator doors opened again. Terrence stepped out. He looked absolutely dreadful. His normally pristine suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose, and he had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. He was holding his cell phone to his ear, arguing aggressively with someone on the other end, likely the bank or his cheap lawyer, Leonard. He marched up to his office doors and swiped his keycard. The reader flashed a hard, angry red. The doors did not budge. Terrence stopped talking on the phone. He frowned, swiping the card again. Red. He swiped it a third time, faster and harder. Red. He grabbed the heavy metal handles and yanked them violently. The doors were sealed shut. Then he finally looked up and read the new red notice taped to the glass. Through the high-definition feed, I watched the exact moment his entire world collapsed. His mouth fell open. He dropped his briefcase. It hit the carpeted floor with a heavy thud, bursting open and spilling meaningless papers everywhere. He pressed both hands against the glass, staring into his dark, inaccessible office like a man watching his house burn to the ground. He started pounding his fists against the thick, reinforced glass, screaming at the top of his lungs. The audio feed picked up his frantic, desperate voice echoing down the empty hallway. "Open the door! Open the door right now!" Two of the building's armed security guards quickly stepped off the nearby service elevator. They approached him calmly but firmly, placing their hands on their utility belts. "Mr. Jackson," the lead guard said, his voice echoing over the feed. "You need to step away from the glass. You are officially locked out of the premises for failure to pay rent. You are trespassing." Terrence spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "You cannot do this to me. I have clients. I have a massive federal loan clearing this week. Let me inside to get my servers. I just need my hard drives." He was not panicked about losing his office chairs. He was panicked because those servers held the unencrypted ledgers of his shell corporations. The very evidence the FBI would be looking for was now locked inside a room he could not access. The servers, computers, and all physical assets inside the suite have been legally seized by the building ownership to cover your massive arrears, the guard explained flawlessly, quoting the exact legal phrasing Mr. Harrison had prepared. "If you try to force entry, we will have you arrested for burglary. You need to leave the building immediately." Terrence looked like he was going to throw a punch, but he realized he was completely outmatched. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. He was hyperventilating, clutching at his chest as the sheer weight of his absolute ruin crushed the breath out of his lungs. His multi-million-dollar image, his arrogant facade, his entire fraudulent empire wiped out before 9 in the morning. The guards escorted him to the elevator. Terrence stumbled inside, holding his head in his hands, completely broken. I switched camera feeds, tracking him as he was marched through the opulent marble lobby of 14 Wall Street. The morning rush hour was in full swing. Dozens of highly successful financial professionals watched as he was publicly frog-marched out of the revolving doors by armed security. He stumbled out onto the busy sidewalk, the cold morning wind hitting his face. He leaned against a concrete planter, gasping for air, looking up at the towering skyscraper. He was a king exiled from his own fake kingdom. I sat back in my chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Terrence pulled out his phone, his hands shaking violently, undoubtedly calling my parents to demand they push the conservatorship hearing as fast as possible. He had absolutely no idea that the anonymous corporate landlord, who just seized his entire life, the one legally holding the keys to his office and all his heavily guarded secrets, was the same grieving widow he was trying to destroy. I spent the rest of the morning at the Manhattan Trust firm, sitting across from Mr. Harrison in his glass-walled conference room as we meticulously reviewed the final defense exhibits for the upcoming conservatorship hearing. My house in the suburbs was completely empty, locked down tight. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, my encrypted cell phone delivered a sharp, vibrating alert. It was a perimeter breach notification from my smart home security system. The motion sensors had detected unauthorized movement. I held up a hand to stop Mr. Harrison mid-sentence and opened the live camera feed on my tablet. There, creeping across my manicured back lawn, were Terrence and Brittany. They looked like absolute shadows of their former selves. Terrence was still wearing the wrinkled suit from his public eviction that morning, his tie completely gone, his collar torn open. He looked feral, sweating profusely in the cool afternoon air. Brittany was dressed in dark athletic wear, constantly looking over her shoulder with nervous, jerky movements, her face pale and terrify. Terrence walked up to the heavy glass of my back patio door. He picked up a large decorative stone from my garden bed. He did not even hesitate. He smashed it violently through the reinforced glass. The loud, sharp sound of shattering glass echoed through my tablet speaker, startling Mr. Harrison. Terrence reached his bleeding arm through the jagged hole, unlocked the deadbolt from the inside, and pulled the door open. Mr. Harrison leaned over the table, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. "Good heavens, Naomi," he whispered, his eyes wide. "They are actually breaking into your home. I will call the local police department right now. We can have patrol cars there in 3 minutes to arrest them for burglary." I reached out and pushed his hand away from his desk phone. "No," I said firmly, my eyes locked on the high-definition screen. "Do not call the local police. A simple breaking and entering charge in a municipal court is entirely too small for the trap I am building. If the local cops arrest them now, my parents will just post their bail by tonight, and it will unnecessarily complicate the federal mandates. Let them dig the hole deeper. I want all of this on the federal record to prove their absolute financial desperation." I switched the camera angles, tracking their movements as they invaded my private sanctuary. They were frantic, tearing through my belongings with the messy, sloppy energy of drug addicts looking for a quick score. Terrence had clearly realized that his business was gone, his investors had fled, and the bank had frozen whatever meager funds he had left. He needed liquid cash immediately, likely to retain a criminal defense attorney for the impending fallout he could sense coming. Brittany sprinted straight upstairs to my master bedroom. I watched the camera feed from my ceiling smoke detector as she tore my closet apart. She was yanking clothes off hangers and pulling out shoe boxes, crying hysterically while she committed the crime. She was grabbing anything she thought held value, shoving my remaining designer shoes, some silk scarves, and a few silver picture frames into a heavy black garbage bag she had brought from her own home. She looked absolutely pathetic, a far cry from the arrogant woman who had humiliated me at the luxury restaurant just 2 nights prior. Downstairs, Terrence practically destroyed my home office. He swept everything off my desk with a violent swipe of his arm, pulling out drawers and dumping my files onto the floor. He was desperately searching for cash, bearer bonds, or perhaps the original copies of David's financial records to somehow prove his forged debt was real. He found a small metal lockbox where I used to keep petty cash and smashed it open with a heavy brass paper weight. It was completely empty, of course. I had moved all valuables to a secure bank vault days ago. Terrence let out a loud scream of pure frustration, kicking my mahogany desk so hard he stumbled backward and fell onto the rug. He scrambled back to his feet, grabbed my backup laptop, a cheap wiped machine I used for basic internet browsing, and shoved it under his arm. He yelled upstairs for Brittany to hurry up, his voice cracking with panic. They ran back out through the shattered patio door, their arms full of garbage bags containing shoes, cheap electronics, and silver trinkets. They scrambled across the lawn and climbed over the back fence like common thieves, terrified of their own shadows. They had broken multiple state laws and committed a felony burglary just to steal maybe $1,000 worth of pawnable items to survive the weekend. I saved the high-definition video files directly to my secure cloud server and forwarded them instantly to the FBI Fraud Division agent working on my case. The agent replied within seconds confirming receipt of the footage. My family was no longer just committing white-collar financial crimes. They had escalated to physical burglary, flawlessly documenting their own desperate motive. The federal case was now absolutely airtight. I looked at Mr. Harrison, smiled, and told him to finalize the court documents. We were completely ready for the conservatorship hearing. Friday morning arrived with a cold, piercing wind sweeping through downtown Manhattan. I stood outside the massive granite columns of the federal family courthouse, taking a deep breath of the crisp air. Today was the day. The trap I had meticulously constructed over the past week was finally ready to be sprung. I smoothed out the skirt of my tailored charcoal gray business suit, gripped the handle of my single leather briefcase, and walked through the heavy revolving doors. When I stepped out of the elevator and into the long marble hallway leading to our assigned courtroom, I saw them immediately. My family was clustered together near the wooden double doors, projecting an aura of absolute unearned arrogance. Gregory and Patricia were dressed in brand new designer clothing that I knew for a fact they had purchased on high-interest credit cards just to keep up appearances for the court. My mother was wearing a ridiculous amount of gold jewelry, trying to look like a responsible, wealthy matriarch. She wanted the judge to see a pillar of the community, not a desperate woman drowning in second mortgages to fund her golden child's fake luxury lifestyle. Brittany was wearing a sleek black dress, holding tightly onto Terrence's arm. Terrence had somehow managed to procure a fresh suit, desperately attempting to hide the fact that he was currently a man without an office, a business, or a future. The dark bags under his eyes were carefully concealed with makeup, but the frantic, twitchy energy of a cornered animal still radiated from him. He was banking his entire survival on this single legal maneuver. Standing next to them was a tall, thin man with a graying beard holding a thick medical clipboard. This was Dr. Aries Thorne, the private psychiatric evaluator my parents had hired. He was a notorious gun for hire in the family court system, a corrupt psychologist known for writing damning mental health evaluations without ever actually speaking to the patients he was diagnosing. As long as the check cleared, Dr. Thorne would testify that anyone was entirely insane. The moment Patricia spotted me walking down the hallway alone, a cruel, victorious smile spread across her face. She nudged Gregory, and the entire group turned to face me like a firing squad. They expected me to show up looking like a disheveled widow trembling and begging for mercy. Instead, I walked toward them with the perfect icy composure of a corporate executive arriving at a hostile takeover. I carried no lawyer by my side, only the heavy leather briefcase that held their complete destruction. "Well, look who decided to show up," my father, Gregory, sneered, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet corridor. "We thought you might have locked yourself in the house after your little public meltdown the other night." I stopped a few feet away from them, keeping my grip steady on the leather briefcase. "I would not miss this for the world, Dad," I said smoothly. Brittany crossed her arms, looking me up and down with blatant disgust. "You should have just wired the money to Terrence when you had the chance, Naomi. Now you are going to lose everything. Dr. Thorne here has thoroughly reviewed your erratic public behavior and your absolute refusal to honor David's debts. He's going to explain to the judge exactly how far gone you really are. Once they stamp the conservatorship, we are taking control of your house by 5-0-0 today." Terrence stepped forward, leaning in close, trying to intimidate me. "It is over, Naomi," he hissed, his breath smelling of stale coffee and pure anxiety. "You thought you could play games with my money, but I always win. You are walking out of here today as a legal ward of the state." I looked directly into Terrence's bloodshot eyes. He was so incredibly stupid. He thought this courtroom was his salvation, completely unaware that the federal agents I had been communicating with were already stationed inside the building, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Before I could respond, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. A uniformed bailiff stepped out into the hallway. "Case number 409, the bailiff announced loudly. "In the matter of the emergency conservatorship petition for Naomi, all parties may now enter the courtroom. Honorable Judge Miller is presiding." My mother patted Dr. Thorne's arm and shot me one final triumphant glare before leading the group inside. Terrence bumped his shoulder aggressively against mine as he walked past. I let them go first. I took one last steadying breath, feeling the solid weight of the evidence inside my briefcase. I followed them into the courtroom, absolutely ready to burn their entire world to the ground. There would be no escape, no second chances, and absolutely no mercy for any of them. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor, and took my seat at the empty defense table. I placed my leather briefcase on the heavy oak desk and folded my hands neatly in my lap. Across the aisle at the petitioner's table, my parents, Brittany, Terrence, and their cheap lawyer, Leonard Clark, were practically buzzing with nervous excitement. Judge Miller, a stern-looking woman in her late 50s, entered the room and took her seat at the high bench. She slammed her wooden gavel once, bringing the room to an immediate heavy silence. She adjusted her glasses, looked down at the thick file my parents had submitted, and signaled for the petitioners to begin their opening statements. Leonard Clark stood up, buttoning his ill-fitting suit jacket. He walked toward the center of the room, putting on a face of deep theatrical concern. "Your Honor," Leonard began, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We are here Ode because a family is desperately trying to save one of their own. Since the sudden and tragic passing of her husband, the respondent Naomi has suffered a catastrophic break from reality." Leonard paced back and forth, gesturing dramatically toward me. He painted a picture of a woman completely unhinged by grief. He described the incident at the luxury restaurant, twisting the facts entirely. He told the judge that I had crashed a private business dinner, screaming hysterically at my family, and hallucinating that I was a multimillionaire. He claimed I was waving a fake credit card around, demanding expensive champagne I could not possibly afford, and publicly insulting the people trying to keep me off the streets. "To support these heartbreaking claims, Your Honor," Leonard continued, "we call our first witness, Dr. Aries Thorne." The corrupt psychologist stood up, walked to the witness stand, and placed his right hand on the Bible. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It was a complete joke. He sat down and adjusted the microphone. Dr. Thorne spoke with a smooth, practiced authority. He claimed he had thoroughly reviewed accounts of my behavior provided by my family. Without ever having spoken a single word to me in his entire life, he confidently diagnosed me with acute grief-induced psychosis and severe financial delusions. He told Judge Miller that I was entirely detached from reality, suffering from grandiose hallucinations regarding my personal wealth. "In my professional medical opinion," Dr. Thorne stated gravely, "Naomi is in immediate danger to her own financial well-being. She is entirely incapable of managing her assets. If left to her own devices, she will squander her remaining savings and end up homeless. It is my strong recommendation that her parents, Gregory and Patricia, be granted full conservatorship to protect her estate." I sat perfectly still, my expression a mask of calm indifference. I did not object. I let him cement his fraudulent medical opinion right into the official court transcript. Leonard thanked the doctor and called his star witness to the stand, Terrence Jackson. Terrence practically strutted to the witness box. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore his oath. He sat down looking directly at me with a smug, victorious grin. He was entirely convinced that he was the smartest man in the building. "Mr. Jackson," Leonard prompted, "could you explain to the court the financial situation your sister-in-law is currently facing?" Terrence leaned into the microphone, his voice smooth and incredibly sincere. "It is a tragedy, Your Honor. David, Naomi's late husband, was a terrible businessman. He died, leaving her drowning in massive, unmanageable debt. To keep his startup afloat, David begged me for a $2 million loan from my own commercial real estate firm. I gave it to him because we are family." Terrence looked at the judge with wide, innocent eyes. "Now that David is gone, the creditors are circling. Naomi is about to lose her house. I had my legal team draft an emergency power of attorney so I could step in, negotiate with the banks, and save her home from foreclosure. But her delusions have made her paranoid. She thinks I am trying to steal from her. She's hoarding her last remaining pennies while I'm just trying to protect her from absolute ruin." It was a breathtaking performance. It was also textbook perjury. Every single syllable he uttered was a documented lie spoken under oath in a court of law. He was testifying that David owed him $2 million. He was testifying that he was a successful, solvent business owner. He was testifying that his forged document was a legitimate tool of salvation. He was digging his grave so deep he would never see the sunlight again. "No further questions, Your Honor," Leonard said, smiling broadly. Terrence stepped down from the witness stand, adjusting his tie, looking incredibly proud of his fabricated testimony. He walked back to his table and sat next to Brittany, who squeezed his hand affectionately. They thought it was over. They thought they had just won the entire war. Judge Miller looked down at her notes, her expression unreadable. She then turned her gaze directly to me. I was sitting alone at the defense table, completely unbothered with no legal representation in sight. Naomi, the judge said, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. You have elected to represent yourself in this highly serious matter. Do you have anything to say in your defense against these severe allegations? I slowly reached out and placed my hand on the brass lock of my leather briefcase. The sharp metallic click of the latches echoing through the silent courtroom sounded like the cocking of a loaded weapon. I did not scramble. I did not rush. I opened the lid with deliberate, calculated precision and pulled out a single neatly bound manila folder. I stood up from the defense table. I did not shed a single tear. My hands were perfectly steady, my posture rigid and unyielding. I smoothed the front of my charcoal gray suit and looked directly up at the high bench. Yes, Your Honor, I said, my voice projecting clearly and confidently across the room. I have a comprehensive defense against every single one of these fabricated allegations. Judge Miller looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. She had just spent the last 20 minutes listening to a lawyer and a corrupt doctor describe a hysterical, mentally broken widow who was completely detached from reality. But the woman standing before her was speaking with the poised, articulate authority of a seasoned corporate executive. The stark contrast between their perjured testimony and my actual physical presence was immediate and jarring. Leonard Clark shifted uncomfortably in his chair at the petitioner's table. He leaned over and whispered something frantic to my father, Gregory. Terrence just crossed his arms trying to maintain his arrogant smirk, but his right leg began to bounce nervously under the wooden table. The confident facade was already beginning to crack. Your Honor, I continued, maintaining unwavering eye contact with the judge. The petitioners have brought forward a paid medical professional to testify that I am suffering from grandiose financial delusions. They claim I am hallucinating personal wealth and that I am currently drowning in unmanageable debt. They argue that this supposed debt makes me an immediate danger to myself and necessitates the stripping of my fundamental civil liberties today. I stepped out from behind the defense table and walked slowly toward the center of the room, holding the folder at my side. However, I stated firmly, one does not need a psychiatric evaluation to disprove a financial delusion. One simply needs empirical documented proof of reality. I am a licensed forensic accountant, Your Honor. I deal exclusively in fact, figures, and verified paper trails. Therefore, I will not be submitting a counter-medical evaluation today. Instead, I ask the court to formally review my primary defense document. I held out the manila folder. The bailiff, a tall man in a crisp uniform, stepped forward, took the folder from my hands, and carried it up to the judge's heavy mahogany bench. I ask the court to enter this into the official record as Exhibit A, I announced, turning my body slightly so I could look directly at Terrence and my parents. Leonard Clark immediately stood up, his face flushed with sudden panic. Objection, Your Honor, he stammered loudly, raising his hand. The respondent has no legal counsel. She cannot simply submit unverified personal documents to contradict a sworn medical diagnosis. We have no idea what she just handed you. It could be a forged bank statement or another manifestation of her tragic psychosis. Judge Miller held up her hand, silencing Leonard instantly. You will have your chance to review the exhibit, Mr. Clark, the judge said sharply. Sit down. Leonard reluctantly sank back into his chair. Terrence stopped bouncing his leg, leaning forward with a sudden intense paranoia. He stared at the folder resting on the judge's desk like it was a live grenade. Judge Miller opened the manila folder. I watched her eyes scan the first page. The document inside was not a standard bank printout. It was not a personal spreadsheet. It was a massive, legally binding portfolio printed on heavy premium archival paper. Even from where Leonard was sitting across the room, he could clearly see the intricate anti-fraud watermarks embedded in the pages and the heavy gold foil embossed seals stamped at the bottom of every single sheet. That is a certified, notarized, and fully verified document directly from the executive offices of the Manhattan Trust Management firm, I explained, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. It is the largest, most heavily regulated private wealth management institution on the East Coast. That specific document was legally finalized and registered with the federal government earlier this week. Judge Miller put on her reading glasses. She flipped to the second page, her eyes scanning the bold, typed paragraphs. The courtroom was so incredibly quiet, you could hear the soft rustle of the thick paper as she turned the page. I watched the judge's expression shift. The stern, skeptical look she had worn since the hearing began completely vanished. Her eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. Her eyes widened behind her glasses. She looked up from the heavy document, staring down at me with absolute astonishment. "Miss Naomi," Judge Miller said, her voice dropping an octave, losing all of its previous judicial detachment. "Are these figures accurate? Are you presenting this as a current verified statement of your personal financial solvency?" I smiled a cold, terrifying smile that was aimed entirely at my family. "They are entirely accurate, Your Honor," I replied. My Mo. Her, Patricia, gripped the edge of her table, her knuckles turning white. Brittany looked at Terrence, pure panic flashing across her face. They had come to court expecting to conquer a helpless victim, but they were suddenly realizing they had walked straight into a slaughterhouse. Judge Miller adjusted her glasses, leaning closer to the heavy parchment, as if she could not quite believe the numbers printed in black ink. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system. "Are you telling this court," the judge began, her voice steady but laced with unmistakable shock, "that you are the sole legal beneficiary of the David Trust, and that the verified liquid assets currently held within this trust total $86 million? "I am, Your Honor," I replied calmly. "And as you will see on page 4 of that same document, the trust also includes the absolute ownership of 2 major commercial real estate properties located directly in the Manhattan Financial District. My late husband was not a failure drowning in debt. He was a quiet, brilliant investor who secured my financial future perfectly. I have absolutely no debt. I have absolutely no need for a conservator." A collective gasp escaped from my family table. Brittany covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with shock and a sudden sickening wave of envy. My mother, Patricia, looked like she had just been physically struck. She stared at me, her jaw hanging slightly open, her mind desperately trying to process the fact that the daughter she had treated like garbage for 34 years was now sitting on a fortune they could not even comprehend. Leonard Clark stood up, his face a blotchy red. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. Even if this document is real, which we still heavily dispute, having money does not mean a person is mentally stable. In fact, sudden wealth could be exactly what triggered her erratic behavior and her paranoid delusions regarding her brother-in-law's completely legitimate business loan." Judge Miller held up a hand, silencing him again. She looked over the rims of her glasses directly at Terrence, who was sitting incredibly rigid in his chair. "Mr. Clark," the judge said sharply, "if your client is the successful commercial real estate broker he just testified to being under oath, and if he supposedly loaned David $2 million from his thriving operating fund, then why does the respondent's financial statement list him as a delinquent tenant?" Leonard froze. "Excuse me, Your Honor." I stepped forward, taking control of the narrative before Leonard could even attempt to formulate a lie. "If you turn to page 7, Your Honor," I said smoothly, pointing toward the heavy folder on the bench, "you will find the tenant manifesto for one of my newly acquired commercial properties, specifically the building located at 14 Wall Street." Terrence's head snapped up, his eyes locked onto mine, wide and wild. The arrogant smirk was completely gone, replaced by a look of dawning absolute horror. "As the new legal owner of that building," I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the room, "I recently had to execute a commercial lockout. The tenant occupying the 4th floor had defaulted on their lease. They were over 60 days behind on rent, unable to pay even their basic operating expenses. I had to legally seize all of their computer servers and office assets just yesterday morning." Judge Miller flipped to page 7. She read the highlighted section and then looked up, her gaze fixing like a laser beam on Terrence. "The delinquent tenant listed here," Judge Miller read aloud, her voice cold and commanding, "is a commercial real estate brokerage registered to Terrence Jackson." The color drained from Terrence's face so fast he looked like a corpse. His skin turned a sickly ashen gray. He slumped back in his wooden chair, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a ragged gasp. He finally understood the aggressive legal notice taped to his glass doors. The tripled rent, the sudden, brutal eviction that had completely destroyed his business less than 24 hours ago. It was not a faceless corporate landlord. It was me. I was the one holding the keys. I was the one who had locked him out on the street. "You," Terrence whispered, his voice trembling so violently it was barely audible. "It was you." Yes, Terrence, I said, looking down at him with absolute freezing contempt. It was me. You stood up there under oath and testified that you were a wealthy savior trying to rescue me from my husband's debts. But the reality is, you are a completely broke, failed broker who could not even afford to pay rent in a building that I now own. You have perjured yourself in a federal court to try and steal my home simply because you were desperate to cover your own massive financial failures. My father Gregory tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Patricia looked at Terrence, the realization hitting her that the brilliant son-in-law she worshipped was actually completely insolvent. The entire foundation of their fake, luxurious reality had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the judge. I did not give them a single moment to recover from the shock. While Terrence sat frozen in his wooden chair, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land, I reached back into my leather briefcase. "Your Honor," I said, bringing the judge's attention back to the bench. The fact that the petitioner's son-in-law is completely bankrupt is certainly relevant to their underlying motives, but the true danger they pose to the public lies in what they were willing to do to secure capital. I would like to submit Exhibit B into evidence. I handed a secondary manila folder to the bailiff, who promptly delivered it to the judge. "This is a certified copy of an emergency power of attorney," I explained smoothly. Terrence Jackson presented this exact document to a federal bank branch just 3 days ago. He was attempting to secure a $500,000 line of credit against my fully paid-off home. He claimed I signed it willingly because I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs due to my overwhelming grief. Leonard Clark jumped up, his voice cracking with desperation. "Your Honor," I vehemently object. "We are here for a family court conservatorship hearing, not a financial audit of my client. This is entirely outside the scope of this petition." Judge Miller waved him down immediately, her face hardening into a mask of judicial wrath. "The petitioner's financial integrity is the absolute core of a conservatorship hearing, Mr. Clark," she snapped loudly. "If your client is using fraudulent documents to seize assets, this court absolutely needs to know about it. Sit down and remain silent." "Proceed, Naomi." I turned toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. To fully authenticate Exhibit B, I have asked a colleague to provide a brief expert testimony. I call Special Agent Thomas Carter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division to the stand. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. My mother, Patricia, let out a tiny, high-pitched squeak of absolute terror, pressing her hands against her pale cheeks. The heavy doors swung open, and Agent Carter, a tall, imposing man in a sharp, dark suit, walked purposefully down the center aisle. He bypassed the petitioner's table without a single glance, swore his oath on the Bible, and took his seat in the witness box. "Agent Carter," I said politely, stepping back to give him the floor, "could you please explain to the court the nature of the signature found on Exhibit B?" Agent Carter leaned into the microphone, his voice echoing with federal authority. "Gladly. The signature on that document is a registered honeypot. It is a specific legally documented forgery designed by Naomi and her late husband years ago as an active fraud alert mechanism. When Terrence Jackson submitted this document to the bank, the signature instantly triggered an automatic federal review. The document is not just invalid. Submitting it to a federally insured institution to secure funds is the textbook definition of felony bank fraud." Terrence practically slid out of his chair. He was violently shaking his head, muttering under his breath that it was a trap, that I had set him up. But his nightmare was only just reaching its climax. "Agent Carter is not the only piece of evidence regarding this specific fraud," I announced to the completely silent court. "I also have a verified time-stamped audio recording taken directly from the security cameras hidden inside my living room. This recording captures the exact moment Terrence Jackson and his legal counsel, Mr. Clark, attempted to extort me using a forged promissory note." Leonard Clark turned the color of chalk. He grabbed his briefcase, looking like he wanted to sprint out of the building. Judge Miller leaned forward, her eyes wide with absolute fury. "Play the recording, Naomi," the judge ordered. I pulled a small digital audio player from my briefcase, placed it on my desk, and pressed play. The crystal-clear audio filled the room. It was Terrence's voice, arrogant and booming. He was bragging in explicit detail about setting up shell corporations in Delaware. He was laughing about taking out multiple commercial lines of credit under his brokerage name and inflating the value of his real estate portfolio. He proudly described wiring fraudulently obtained funds across state lines to wash the money. Then came the absolute death blow. The recording played the exact moment Terrence threatened me in my own home. "I will offer you a deal," asterisk his recorded voice sneered. "Wire me every single dollar of liquid cash you currently possess by tomorrow morning. If you give me whatever savings you have to help stabilize my company, I will hold off on seizing the house for another month. Refuse, and my lawyer here will start eviction and liquidation process on Friday." I pressed stop. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and entirely permanent. The arrogant real estate broker who had marched into the courtroom expecting an easy victory had just been completely dismantled. He had confessed to bank fraud, wire fraud, extortion, and money laundering, all in his own words, broadcasted directly to a federal judge and an active FBI agent. His massive ego had finally destroyed him. The silence in the courtroom was so absolute that I could hear the erratic, shallow breathing coming from Terrence's chest. Judge Miller sat frozen behind her heavy mahogany bench, her eyes locked onto the digital audio player resting on my desk. The sheer audacity of what she had just heard completely stripped away any remaining shred of judicial neutrality. She took a deep breath, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked like a whip. "Mr. Clark," Judge Miller said, her tone dripping with absolute venom. "You and your clients came into my courtroom today and attempted to weaponize the legal system against a perfectly sane, grieving widow. You presented a purchased, entirely fraudulent medical diagnosis from a corrupt doctor to strip away her civil liberties. And you did all of this while your star witness was actively committing severe federal crimes to cover his own massive financial incompetence." Leonard Clark was shaking so violently his knees were practically knocking together against the wooden table. He threw his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "Your Honor, I swear to you, I had absolutely no knowledge of the bank fraud. I was only retained for the family court petition. I was lied to just like the court." "Save it for the state disciplinary committee, Mr. Clark," the judge snapped sharply. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. "The emergency petition for the conservatorship of Naomi is hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering the court clerk to immediately forward the entire transcript of this hearing, along with the petitioner's sworn financial disclosures, directly to the district attorney for a full perjury investigation regarding Gregory and Patricia." The gavel came down with a deafening crack. The sound made my mother jump out of her seat. Gregory grabbed his chest, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. They had volunteered their own financial records, and now those records were going to be scrutinized by criminal investigators. But the nightmare for Terrence was far from over. Agent Carter stood up from the witness box. He buttoned his dark suit jacket and looked directly down at Terrence. "Judge Miller is correct," Agent Carter announced, his voice carrying the full, terrifying weight of the federal government. "This family court matter is officially concluded. However, the federal investigation into Terrence Jackson is currently active and fully authorized." Right on cue, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The heavy, measured footsteps of 2 United States Marshals echoed across the polished hardwood floor. They were massive, intimidating men, wearing dark tactical vests with federal law enforcement insignia clearly visible on their chests. They walked straight down the center aisle, their eyes locked entirely on the petitioner's table. They bypassed me completely, treating me exactly like the protected federal informant I had become. They approached the table where my family sat frozen in absolute terror. "Terrence Jackson," the lead marshal said, his voice deep and uncompromising. "You are under arrest for federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and criminal extortion. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Brittany let out a blood-curdling scream. She grabbed onto Terrence's arm, pulling him toward her as if she could physically shield him from the federal agents. "No, you cannot take him," she shrieked hysterically, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "He is a wealthy broker. You are making a mistake. Naomi is the one who is crazy. She set us up." But Terrence knew it was not a mistake. All the arrogance, all the fake Wall Street bravado had completely drained out of his body. He was nothing but an empty, terrified shell. He gently pushed his screaming wife away and slowly stood up from his chair. He did not look at me. He stared blankly ahead as the marshal grabbed his arms and forcefully pulled them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the room. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute justice. The second marshal began reading Terrence his rights with cold, practiced efficiency. They turned him around and began marching him toward the back doors. Brittany collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. My parents just stared in absolute shock, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic destruction of their golden child's perfect life. Terrence was paraded right past my defense table. For one brief second, he finally looked at me. His eyes were wide and filled with tears of terror. I did not blink. I did not smile. I just watched him take his final steps as a free man. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind the federal agents, sealing Terrence's fate permanently. Inside the courtroom, the suffocating silence finally shattered. It did not break with tears of sorrow, but with the frantic, ugly sounds of absolute self-preservation. The illusion of our perfect united family had been entirely vaporized the moment Judge Miller mentioned a perjury investigation. My father, Gregory, collapsed back into his wooden chair, clutching his chest as he gasped for air. He was a man who had spent his entire life obsessing over his pristine reputation at the country club. Now his sworn financial disclosures were on their way to the district attorney. He knew exactly what the criminal investigators would find. They would find the hidden second mortgages, the illegal asset transfers, and the thousands of dollars he and my mother had secretly funneled into Terrence's fraudulent shell corporations to keep their golden child living in luxury. My mother, Patricia, stood frozen for a few seconds before her survival instincts violently kicked in. She looked at the closed doors, then looked down at her hands, and finally turned her gaze toward Brittany. The maternal warmth she had faked for decades vanished completely. She did not kneel to comfort her sobbing, hysterical daughter. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of pure self-righteous fury. "This is your fault!" Patricia suddenly shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceiling of the courtroom. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Brittany's face. "You and that criminal husband of yours did this. You dragged us into this mess. We only signed those financial disclosures because Terrence swore the money was guaranteed. You lied to us, Brittany. You told us he was a genius. You told us he was saving Naomi." Brittany stopped crying, looking up at our mother in absolute shock. The golden child, who had never faced a single consequence in her entire 32 years of life, was suddenly being thrown directly underneath the wheels of a moving bus by her own biggest protector. "I lied to you," Brittany screamed back, scrambling to her feet. Her black dress was wrinkled. Her perfect hair was a mess. "You knew exactly what he was doing. You knew his firm was failing for years. You took out a second mortgage on your own house to bail him out because you were too embarrassed to admit your perfect daughter married a broke loser. You are just as guilty as he is." Leonard Clark, the chief lawyer, frantically backed away from the table, practically pressing himself against the wall to avoid being associated with the imploding family. Gregory suddenly jumped up, his face red with rage. "Shut your mouth, Brittany," he bellowed. "Do not say another word in this room. We were trying to protect you. We bankrupted ourselves to pay for your ridiculous designer lifestyle. Protect me." Brittany laughed hysterically, her voice shrill and manic. "You did not care about protecting me. You just wanted the bragging rights. You wanted to parade Terrence around like a trophy while you treated Naomi like absolute garbage. You sat in her living room and helped him plan how to steal her house. Do not act like you are innocent victims now that the FBI is involved. You enabled every single thing he did." The courtroom had devolved into a complete circus. The toxic foundation of our family was fully exposed, and they were viciously tearing each other to pieces to save their own skins. They had spent my entire life presenting a united front against me. But the moment the threat of federal prison was introduced, loyalty evaporated. Patricia lunged forward, raising her hand as if she was going to physically strike her favorite daughter right in front of the judge. "That is enough," Judge Miller roared, slamming her gavel down multiple times. "Bailiffs, remove these people from my courtroom immediately. If they want to confess to federal crimes, they can do it in a holding cell." Two uniformed court officers quickly grabbed Gregory and Patricia by their arms, while a third officer physically separated Brittany from her mother. They were dragged down the center aisle, screaming and cursing at each other. Patricia was calling Brittany an ungrateful brat. Brittany was screaming that her parents were going to rot in prison. They did not even look at me as they were forcefully escorted out the doors. They had completely forgotten the wealthy widow they came to conquer. They were entirely consumed by the monster they had created together. I remained calmly seated at the defense table, watching the chaotic exit with absolute serene satisfaction. The trash was finally taking itself out. 8 months have passed since that spectacular implosion in the federal courthouse. The legal fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Terrence Jackson, the arrogant broker who thought he could outsmart the federal banking system and steal my home, was officially sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. The prosecution did not even have to work hard to secure the conviction. Between the honeypot signature on the forged documents, the crystal-clear audio recording from my living room, and the unencrypted financial servers I legally handed over to the FBI after the commercial lockout, his expensive defense attorney practically begged for a plea deal. Terrence lost his real estate license, his fake corporate empire, and his freedom. He will spend the next 8 years sitting in a small concrete cell wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, having plenty of time to reflect on the exact moment he decided to cross a forensic accountant. Without Terrence's fraudulent cash flow, Brittany's fake luxury lifestyle completely evaporated overnight. The banks foreclosed on her massive house, repossessed her leased luxury vehicles, and froze all of her joint accounts. She tried to pivot, taking to the internet to launch another tearful smear campaign, casting herself as the innocent betrayed wife who knew absolutely nothing about her husband's elaborate financial crimes. But the internet is undefeated. Someone leaked the court transcripts, including her own manic admission that she knew Terrence's firm was failing. Her followers turned on her immediately, flooding her pages with angry comments. Her corporate sponsors dropped her. Her social media empire was permanently destroyed, and she became a local pariah. I eventually heard through the grapevine that the former golden child is currently living in a cheap rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. She was even caught trying to pawn the exact same designer handbags she stole from my bedroom just to afford basic groceries. As for my parents, Gregory and Patricia, their desperate attempt to save their own skins failed spectacularly. The district attorney launched a full perjury and financial fraud investigation based on the fake conservatorship documents they willingly submitted. To avoid serving actual jail time as co-conspirators, they had to liquidate almost everything they owned to pay exorbitant legal fees, restitution, and federal fines. They were forced to sell their pristine suburban home at a massive loss. The prestigious country club they loved so much permanently revoked their membership in disgrace. Their wealthy friends entirely shunned them, refusing to associate with admitted fraudsters. They are now trapped in a cramped rented apartment, drowning in crushing debt, spending their days bitterly screaming at each other in a miserable echo chamber of their own making. I did not attend Terrence's sentencing hearing. I did not reach out to Brittany when she lost her home, and I did not answer the frantic pleading voicemails my mother left me before I changed my phone number. I enacted a strict absolute no-contact boundary with all of them. I cut the dead weight from my life completely and without a single ounce of regret. Instead of dwelling on the past, I focused entirely on my future. I sold the house in the suburbs. It held too many memories, both good and incredibly toxic. I officially took over the management of the David Trust and the 2 commercial buildings on Wall Street. I even moved my own forensic accounting firm into the exact same premium office suite Terrence was evicted from, completely remodeling the space to serve as my new corporate headquarters. Right now, I am standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly renovated penthouse apartment in New York City. The view is absolutely breathtaking. The city lights stretch out before me like a sea of diamonds against the dark night sky. The air up here is clean, quiet, and perfectly peaceful. I have built a life defined by genuine success, absolute financial independence, and unapologetic self-respect. David left me the tools to secure my future, but I was the one who swung the hammer that shattered the toxic chains binding me to my abusers. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by respect, loyalty, and love. When those things are violently weaponized against you, you have no obligation to stay and be a victim. I took a slow sip of my wine, watching the bustling city below, feeling a profound sense of permanent closure. The long, exhausting war is finally over, and I emerged completely victorious. Have you ever had to let the trash take itself out? Tell me your story in the comments and do not forget to subscribe. The most striking takeaway from Naomi's harrowing journey is the profound power of emotional discipline in the face of devastating betrayal. When confronted with the ultimate treachery by her own flesh and blood just hours after her husband's funeral, the natural human response would be to scream, cry, or violently confront her abusers. However, Naomi teaches us that explosive anger often surrenders our power directly to those who wish to harm us. By remaining meticulously calm and leaning into her intellect rather than her raw emotions, she transformed her temporary vulnerability into an impenetrable shield. Toxic individuals, especially narcissistic family members who have spent decades casting you as the scapegoat, thrive on emotional reactions. They use your pain as leverage to manipulate the narrative and validate their cruelty. Naomi's story brilliantly illustrates that silence and strategic patience are often the most devastating boundaries you can establish against abusers. She did not waste her energy trying to convince her family to love her, nor did she engage in pointless screaming matches to prove her worth. Instead, she stepped back and allowed their unchecked arrogance, greed, and absolute lack of morality to become the very instruments of their own destruction. She simply gave them enough room to completely reveal their true selves to the world. Ultimately, this narrative serves as a vital reminder that our worth, safety, and future are not tethered to the people who happen to share our DNA. Walking away from a toxic family is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of profound self-preservation. You do not owe your peace to those who actively plot your ruin, and walking away can be your greatest victory. If you have ever had to summon the courage to cut toxic relatives out of your life to protect your peace, share your story in the comments below and subscribe to join.